and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for joining us for the launch of the FINSAC Commission Archives. Please stand for the playing of the national anthem. Thank you. You may be seated. At this time, I want to acknowledge Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance and the Public Service, Honorable Xavier Main, State Minister in the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, the lovely, the great, hardly sure, former Minister of Finance at the Ministry, of course, and specially invited guests, members of the media, and those joining us online. Good morning again, and welcome to the launch of the FINSAC Commission Archives. I am Shaquille Rochester Shorter, and I'll be your moderator for today. All right, so this morning we are launching the publication of the FINSAC Commission Archives that will provide an opportunity for stakeholders, researchers, and members of the public to access valuable insights from various perspectives that will add to public understanding of that period. The material gathered by the Commission and which will be included in the archives includes contributions from then government officials, economists, academics, former leaders of failed financial institutions, and customers of those institutions. So, with that said, we will get to the meat of the matter. We will now invite Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark to bring remarks. Make him welcome, please.
Good morning, everyone. First, let me begin by expressing gratitude to the staff at the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, in particular, the legal department led by Terry-Ann Finnegan, the communications department led by Shaquille Rochester, and to Stephanie Abrahams from my own office, and of course, all supervised by the financial secretary for the work that they have done to make these archives available online today. Many times you see the dazzle, the product, the end product, and nobody knows what goes into that product. And I must tell you that to get all of those documents up online in time for this morning's presentation took going the extra mile. And I want to publicly recognize these individuals for what they have done. Please give them a round of applause. Madam Master of Ceremonies, Minister of State in the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Xavier Main, former Minister of Finance and Public Service, Audley Shaw. I'm seeing former Commissioner of the FINSAC Commission, I think the only surviving member of the original commission, was one of the, Mr. Charles Ross. I believe the daughter of the Secretary to the commission is here. De Peralta, where are you? There she is. Welcome. and I'm seeing various other persons who have been associated with FINSAC over the years who are here in the audience this morning. This presentation is being streamed online. Welcome to members of the media who are here in person and to those who have joined online. The FINSAC Commission was established by proclamation by the Governor General in January of 2009. And it was tasked to inquire into the circumstances that led to the collapse of the financial sector in the 1990s, with particular reference to whether those factors were domestic or external in nature. As far as domestic factors are concerned, to consider the monetary and fiscal policy environment at the time and whether those were contributory factors, to examine the role of the boards of directors of financial companies at the time and the management, and to ascertain what their responsibility was and to what extent decisions they made were contributory factors, and also to look into the government's regulatory environment to establish whether or not inadequacies were to blame for the collapse in the financial sector. The Commission was also asked to look into the operations of FINSAC and whether decisions were made on an even-handed and fair basis, to look into the terms and conditions for the sale of the portfolio to the Jamaica Redevelopment Foundation of the loan portfolio, and to ascertain whether that was fairly handled and whether the liquidation of assets, etc., was done on a neutral basis, among a few other items. The Commission was plagued with problems from the very beginning. A chairman of the Commission had to be replaced after being challenged in court. The Commission had problems finding a place to meet. It took 9 months to find a suitable venue. And even after that venue was found and the chairman was replaced, the Commission had starts and stops over the intervening period, inclusive of starts and stops due to changes in the government. By 2018, the Cabinet had lost confidence in the Commission's ability to produce a report, even though they would have started, and in the archives there are, I believe, 2 or 3 chapters of a report that was, of the initial report. But the Cabinet, having provided funds and additional funds over time on the promise of the report, felt that there's too much exposure for providing resources with no report forthcoming. As such, in, I believe it was February 2019, the Commission resigned, and I think it was Commissioner Charles Ross himself who came to my office and presented me with an electronic disc that contained all of the submissions and documents presented to the FINSAC Commission. The good news is that the FINSAC Commission had long completed its public hearings. So there's no more information for the FINSAC Commission to gather. They had gathered all the information over the ensuing years that they had planned to gather. And they were in the write-up phase, which was just consuming too much resources with promises that, look, we're going to get it done with another 30 million, and that is finished, no report, and it happened at least 2 times. So, from my perspective as Minister of Finance, being presented with this material, I abide by the principle of everybody having a responsibility to water your own garden, i.e. everybody has your sphere of responsibility, your sphere of influence, and it is the responsibility of us all to handle those spheres in the best way we can. So being presented, I came into this essentially being presented with a stick that had all of this information. What now is my responsibility in that? The commission has resigned. There's no commission. The hearings are finished. I certainly did not think it would be appropriate for that jump drive to end up in the waste bin or for it to be in file 13. The collapse of the financial sector in the 1990s was arguably the most monumental domestic economic event in Jamaica's independent history. It led to an accumulation of debt that represented 40% of GDP. And it has taken 30 years approximately for that debt to be wound down. Prior to FINSAC, Jamaica's debt to GDP ratio was in the low 70s. By 2002, our debt to GDP was over, I believe, 115%, on its way to 120%. And the rest is history. The accumulation of that debt led to a situation by 2002, 2003, where interest and wages alone exceeded tax revenues. I want you to understand, interest and wages alone exceeded tax revenue. There's no road, no classroom, no drugs for the hospital, no PATH program, no capital expenditure, no other item of expenditure. Just those two exceeded tax revenues. It was, unsustainable is too light of a word to use. And it plunged our country essentially into crisis when inevitable shocks came. And so it is incumbent upon us as a society, now that we have attained a debt level that is lower than the pre-FINSAC era, and we're on track by the end of this fiscal year for a debt level in the high 60s. 67% is the forecast. It is incumbent upon us to ensure that the material gathered in the public hearings during the life of the FINSAC Commission are available to the public for edification, scrutiny, academic research, and most importantly, to ensure that we do not traverse this path again. And it is that conviction that led the Ministry of Finance on a path that has led to this morning. This is not a path that started yesterday or that even started in my budget presentation when I made the announcement back in March. This is something that would have started approximately 2 years ago with trying to find the best way to get this material into the public domain, and there would have been quite a few iterations. Now, it's important to note that in the disclosure of this material, great care has been taken to ensure that we observe the legislative environment as it exists today. And in this, I am not my own advisor, and I have to subject myself to the advice of the professionals who are permanently employed in the public bureaucracy. As such, a committee was appointed consisting of lawyers in the Ministry of Finance and others to review all of the material. And they would have gone through all of the documents that were on that electronic drive. We're talking about lots of documents. To redact any information that is personal in nature, that and that does not meet the test for public disclosure. they would have recommended that one or two out of thousands of documents would not be fit for disclosure, not for reasons that they contain any smoking gun, but that it would establish a precedent that would be problematic. But I don't want us to focus on that. I can say more about that in a second. So what we have here and are going to reveal today are the documents that were handed over. And this is not a file of debtor information, if anybody is, right? Not a file of who owe money and who never owe money and who don't pay back. That's not what this is. This consists of submissions made to the commission. And you have people came to the commission and made oral submissions, i.e. they were interviewed by the commissioners, and the transcripts of those interviews are all available. And there are those who would have submitted written submissions to the commission. Now, the oral submissions, and some of the oral and written coincided, would have been carried in the media at the time. So there's a lot of information that is already in the media because the hearings were public, and when those hearings were undertaken, the media covered those hearings. But there are other material that were submitted that would not have been aired in a similar fashion. So the Commission Archives represents the perspectives on this era from different categories of stakeholders. You have the perspectives of debtors, those who came forward to report of their experiences of borrowing from financial institutions and getting caught in the vortex that was the 1990s interest rate environment. You have the perspective of the major shareholders of financial institutions who came forward and provided their accounts of their stewardship and the problems and challenges that they faced. And you have the perspective of the policymakers, of the administrators of FINSAC, and I believe of some regulators as to how events unfolded from their point of view. To get a complete picture of this very important chapter in Jamaican life, it is important that all perspectives are considered. Running with a perspective that suits your particular agenda, whoever your is, does a disservice to the intent of the publication of the archives. The intent is that Jamaica learns from this experience and that this never recurs. In order to, and by publishing this archives, this event took place, as we discussed, 30 years ago. We've waited 30 years for this. So there's no rush now to jump to conclusions, or there ought not to be a rush to jump to conclusions, to read one document and then conclude. We've waited 30 years. Yeah? So the government, the Ministry of Finance, were taking a long-term perspective with the publication of these archives, and we're going to make funding available to the University of the West Indies, $10 million, the University of Technology, $10 million, to catalyze a process where there's a call for research proposals from interested researchers, and there's an independent and transparent mechanism of awarding research grants with the view that researchers, qualified researchers, can interrogate this database and supplement it with other pertinent material and produce works of scholarship on this important period in our history. And it is hoped that in the adjudication of these research grants, it'll be done in such a way that we don't have overlapping research, but we have researchers looking into this period from various perspectives. I will end by expressing thanks to the commissioners who sat for many years under very frustrating conditions. And Charles Ross is here, and I thank you for coming. And thank you for your service to the country. It doesn't turn out in the most optimal way, but we have taken lemons and we're going to make lemonade by making the information available, and your work and your service will eventually be seen as of value to the country. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, I'm going to thank you, and we're going to turn over to the launch of the FINSAC Commission Archives. Now, let me just say this before we do that. One of the signal lessons from this period is the role that financial sector stability plays in economic stability. We are rightly focused on the fiscal question, rightly focused on the inflation question, both important to economic stability, rightly focused on the sufficiency of foreign exchange. Those are all, I would say, in the front, and everybody knows that those are important for economic stability. But one of the most critical factors for economic stability is financial sector stability. And as such, regulation has to keep pace with the innovation in the sector. And the regulations that are on the books that are being prepared, the Twin Peaks regulation, absolutely critical to financial sector stability going forward, given the complexion, the makeup, and the structure of our particular financial sector, where financial conglomerates control 90% of financial sector assets. And financial sector regulation must continue to be free of undue influence. Regulators have to be completely empowered to do their work with a transparent appeals process that exists, that does not involve the political class. That is critical for Jamaica's long-term future. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of independent, strong financial sector regulation. It's for that reason why we have embarked on the Twin Peaks reform, which is far advanced. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to welcome Shaquille back to the podium, and she'll take you through the FINSAC Commission Archives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Clark. So please turn your attention to the monitor here, and the archives will be available on the Ministry of Finance and the Public Services website at mof.gov.jm/FINSAC Commission Archives. So, as it states, the official public archives for all information gathered by the Financial Sector Adjustment Company, FINSAC Commission, during its examination of the circumstances that led to the collapse of financial institutions in the 1990s. So we have background information, we have the challenges, we have the timeline of events. We also have the cost for the inquiry, and now we are at the archives. So please note that the archives are being published, as Minister stated, with redactions and minor changes to protect the personal privacy of individuals in relation to their business affairs, names, addresses, and other identifiers, and to comply with the Data Protection Act the Access to Information Act, and other relevant laws. Otherwise, the archive has remained substantially in the same state as received by the commissioners upon their resignations. So, if you notice, you see some folders here. And we have the legal submissions, we have the summary draft reports, BOJ reports, witness statements and submissions, transcripts, agreement for acquisition of intervened institutions, list of hearings, papers, forensic reports, so many. All right? So we're going to just, yes, that was received. So these, as Minister mentioned, these are the same folders that the ministry received. All right? So I'm going to open a few, not all today, but we're going to open a few. And if you go to the ministry's website, if you go on the first page, the landing page of the ministry's website, it will be in the carousel, and you can click from there to get to the page, or you can just type it in Google, and it will come up. All right, so we can look at legal submissions. And these are the files received. We can look at some witness. Okay, we can open a file. All right. Repeat that, Minister? Oh, all right. So the collapse of financial institutions in Jamaica in the 1990s, submission by FINSAC. Prepared and submitted by Samuda and Johnson, attorney at law for FINSAC, November 8, 2011. So the files are detailed as we receive them. All right, so we can go to another folder, witness statements and submissions. So you see it's listed again as we receive them. So you see everything, the names of witnesses, some witnesses that can be published. We also have transcripts. And they're listed by the year. We have some other related documents. And we also have records of the questions. So, in essence, the files are there. Substantial files are there. Give and take, where that meant is to protect persons' private or personal information. All right. Minister, it's your turn. So we can take questions from the media, and the Honorable Minister will answer those. Okay. Minister.
Sure. Andrew Laidley from Jamaica Information Service. Minister, having perused the documents yourself, I wonder if you could share with us any salient points or key findings that you thought did not exist at the time from the witnesses' reports and from reports from the Commission that structurally caused some kind of imbalance or the collapse in the 1990s, having perused those documents yourself?
So, Andrew, that's a complex question, and the government is interested in transparency, and I think we're not perfect, but there is a track record of being transparent with economic and financial data, and that is what you're seeing here. The question that you pose is the central question. yeah? And I say complex because there are a number of factors that one has to examine. There are many truths. It is certainly true that the economic environment was acutely hostile to economic activity and to financial sector stability. But at the same time, the foreign-owned institutions did not fail. Right? So it is true the environment was hostile, and I think in a hostile environment, you're going to have, the law of the jungle, right? The weakest will fall, right? And it is also true that the regulatory environment was way below what would have been required for the kind of activities that were taking place. There was a response, we will all remember. The Financial Services Commission came into existence after the FINSAC debacle, which is a major regulatory reform. And we also had the Securities Act, and many other financial services acts that came into being after the FINSAC period, which speaks to the gaps in the regulatory environment that existed at the time. There's also the factor of the liberalization of the financial services and the and the monetary environment without the prerequisites. And then obviously, there are questions as to the kind of decisions that financial sector entities made. And you'll see in the record of the policymakers at the time that, some of those were questionable. So it's it was a perfect storm, multiplicity of factors, but there's no doubt that the economic environment, you have 80% inflation in 1991, I believe, 40% in 1992, 25% in 1993, interest rates that reached 30, 40, 50%. That's a recipe for disaster, without a doubt. But if we stop there, we will miss other important factors that we ought not to miss.
Siobhan Campbell, Nationwide News. My question is in relation to the one that came prior. Considering the lack of a concrete report without recommendations and findings, is something lost essentially to history in terms of lessons that could have been learned from that time period? And under those considerations, is there a concern that without those concrete conclusions, that crises such as FINSAC could happen again?
Right. So, in some ways, we're better off by having the submissions ourselves, rather than having the conclusions of a set of three people. What we can potentially have if these archives are harvested, what we can potentially have is a deeper set of conclusions drawn from a wider set of expertise. So rather than, I'm not saying that John Brown on the road who look at one document, and I'm not talking about that, but I'm saying if we can really entice the academic community, the policymaking, retired policymaking community, etc., to examine these archives and these folders, we can get valuable perspectives from a number of sources. So contrary to the premise of the question, by hosting these archives on the website, accessible by anyone in perpetuity, what we do is to ensure that the lessons of this period are learned not just by this generation, but generations to come. Yeah? And as I alluded to earlier, there are multiple factors that we have to consider. The economic environment, the domestic environment, which was clearly seriously problematic, the regulatory environment, which was clearly unprepared for events, and the practices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's it's a deep set of resources that are, and information that is available that we are going to try to catalyze its proper use over time with the research grants. And I believe that ultimately we will be the better off long term, for the availability of this information and for the transparency that we're displaying today.
Minister, I just wanted you to clarify and state categorically if by instituting these research grants, you are in a way seeking to achieve what the Commission could not and did not, which was an actual report with recommendations and findings.
By providing the research grants, we're seeking to catalyze scholarship and scholarly research into this period, using the archives, but not exclusive to the archives. It could be information from other sources that complements information here, so that we can have, peer-reviewed scholarly output that can assist policymakers in the future. We are looking forward, Andrew. All right? The past is the past. And as I said, under the principle of watering your own garden, my garden didn't consist of, commissioners at the start, etc. My garden is, essentially joined a cabinet that decided not to fund any further, and I got a stick. And what do I do with that stick? And I think I have faithfully delivered on my responsibility with the support of the cabinet, clearly. And that's what we have here today.
Just a final question, Minister, from me. Considering the nature and the impact of that period of time, and I think you alluded to it in Parliament earlier this week, that there are many Jamaicans who are either too young or simply weren't even born during the period that this took place. And to them, the concept of FINSAC and the impact it had was quite arbitrary. Yeah. Why not expand the grants beyond just scholarly research to something more culturally relevant, or socially relevant, I should say?
Yes, that's a very good point. We certainly having productions on the FINSAC era in a dramatic form in the theater or in a documentary would be very, 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 very useful. I would think we provided $500 million to the Film Commission. I would hope that they could reserve just a little small portion of that for proposals from filmmakers who want to use the archives to make artistic output that can reach a broader audience. I think that's an excellent question, and it is consistent with my own thoughts, which I think I've voiced publicly before. Yeah.
Minister, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to portions of the archives which would have been redacted. Just expound a little bit more. I know you mentioned for personal and privacy concerns, but just for Jamaicans who might need a little bit more information about the kinds of information that might not be included in the archives, if you could just speak a little bit more to that. Right.
So the redactions take out, so for example, so somebody comes before the commission and they say, they have volunteered to come forward, and they say, I borrowed $100, the interest rate was 5% or whatever, 10%, and in 3 years that $100 ballooned to $1,000. My mom was a guarantor, her name is Ivy, and my mom had to sell her house. Well, the debtor came forward of his own volition, but Miss Ivy did not. So it's not fair to Miss Ivy for her name to be in the archives. So we have sought in instances like that to ensure that Miss Ivy's name doesn't appear. Also, if somebody comes forward and says, coming before a commission, you have to say, hi, I am John Anthony Brown. I live at 4 Riverside clause is not necessary and it doesn't add any value to include 4 Riverside clause. So that has been redacted.
Thank you, Minister Clark. All right, so as we have said earlier and many times before, we have received multiple documents from various perspectives, and we have uploaded them to the Ministry of Finance and the Public Services website for your view, review, and insights of that period when all this happened, right? So it's available to all Jamaicans. Okay, let me take this off. Yes. So it's available to all Jamaicans, well, the public at large, and you can definitely go on the Ministry of Finance and Public Service website at mof.gov.jm/FINSAC Commission Archives, or you can go from the front of the website and you'll see it right on the carousel, and you can access these files and data. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for the launch of the FINSAC Commission Archives. Thank you.